This is the first sweater I ever knitted. I made it 9 years ago and I finished it in about 14 days, and it's still one of my favorite handmade pieces that I own. I want to tell you about how I made it because I think it says everything about what I wish I would have known when I first started knitting, and it's just one of the 10 tips I'm going to share with you in this video. This pattern is called Stokkur and it is a design by Isolde Teague, and it's an Aran weight sweater that's knitted from the bottom up and has a colorwork yoke. And it might sound like a terrible idea to choose this project as your first garment project, and maybe it was, but I told myself at the very beginning that I wouldn't need to understand the whole construction of the sweater once I got started. I just needed to understand the first round. So since this sweater is knitted from the bottom up, I started with the ribbing, which I knew how to do, and then I made the body. Then I had to knit the 2 sleeves and join everything together. So that was the first thing that I was a bit unsure about, but I found a tutorial on YouTube and I made it. And then it came to the colorwork yoke, and I had never knitted colorwork before, so I watched another 2 or 3 YouTube videos maybe and did these few rounds of colorwork. And then in the end, what was a bit more challenging to me was the 3 needle bind off to close off the gap under the arms. And I found another tutorial on YouTube, did that, and then I was so proud. I wove in all the ends, put the sweater on for the first time. And then I realized that I had done the 3 needle bind off wrong because I had not put the right sides together when doing it. So I instead put the wrong sides together, which meant that I had a very visible seam here under both arms. And as you can imagine, that was quite frustrating because I then had to unpick everything. But I fixed it, and I've worn this sweater for the past 9 years. So this video is about everything I wish I would have known someone told me when I first started knitting. So let's get into it. Tip 1. You don't have to feel ready, just start. The biggest thing that stood between me and the sweater that I wanted to make wasn't the construction of the sweater or the colorwork yoke or the 3 needle bind off. It was actually a voice in my head telling me that I should maybe hold off and wait a little bit more and practice a bit more before I can really tackle a whole sweater knitting project. It told me that I'm just not experienced enough. Or what if I buy all this yarn and then lose steam halfway through the project, and then what to do with this half-finished sweater. And I think that voice in your head is the single biggest thing that is standing between most people and the knitting that they would like to do. Because there is always going to be a lace you have not tried yet, or a sock construction that you have not done yet, or another, let's say a different sweater construction. There is always going to be something to learn that you have not done yet. And just, holding off until someday, until you feel ready, is just another way of procrastinating. And I think that is something that is not only true for knitting, but for life in general. And the solution is actually very simple. You take a big, complex project and break it down into small, manageable steps. Don't think about everything, as a whole, like a big mountain of things you don't know how to do. Think about it in small, manageable steps. The ribbing, the body, the sleeves, the joining of the body and the sleeves, the yoke, the bind off, and so on. And that way everything becomes much more manageable. And in addition, there are so many resources that are there to help you. There is Ravelry, there is YouTube, and the knitting community as a whole is one of the most generous and friendly communities that I know of. So if you need support, you can just ask for help. And I do want to say something specifically to the people out there who don't have anyone in their personal life who knits, like a mother or grandmother or friend who can support them and who they can ask questions for too. Because that person used to be me. I don't have anyone in my personal life who knits, and I genuinely just didn't know if I would ever be able to create a garment that would look good enough so that I could wear it. And now I have a wardrobe full of handmade knitwear and a YouTube channel about it. You can do this. You just have to start. One small caveat that I wish someone had told me when I first started knitting: if you want to make some changes to the pattern, try not to make too many changes at once. So if you want to change the yarn, for example, try to stick with a yarn that has a very similar weight and also fiber content. Or if you want to make some modifications to the pattern, start by making only one or just very few modifications, like let's say lengthening the sleeves, for example. You need to set yourself up for success for your first larger knitting project, because if you do, and if you then create something you truly love, this will really foster a lifelong love for knitting. Tip 2. Knitting is so much more than the finished object. When I first started knitting more seriously, I thought knitting was about creating garments that you then can wear, as a very practical way of creating clothing. And it definitely is, because there's nothing quite like the feeling of putting on a handmade garment for the first time. But I also very quickly realized that knitting is so much more than just the finished object. It's the whole process that means something to me, that is so much larger than, just having something to wear on your body. Because somewhere along the way, I realized that knitting does something to my nervous system that almost nothing else does. There is a rhythm to it. The needles, the yarn, the quiet repetition of a stitch you've done 1,000 times, that slows everything down. On difficult days, or on days where my brain won't stop, I can pick up my knitting and something settles. It's not magic, but it's just that your hands are busy and your mind is given permission to rest. And then there's the pride. The specific particular pride of wearing something you made yourself, from yarn and needles and your own 2 hands. I notice it every time I put on one of my handmade sweaters, this particular kind of satisfaction that I don't get from anything I've ever bought, no matter how much I loved it. And beyond that, and that is something that I find genuinely moving, is that when you are knitting, you are joining a long line of makers that stretches back hundreds, thousands of years. You are connected through the ages with the people who also made the same movement, held the yarn in their hands and created garments for themselves. And I think that connection is generally just so beautiful. Knitting also changed the way I think about clothes entirely. When you understand how long it takes to make a sweater, the hours, the focus, the care, you look at fast fashion very differently. You start to understand the true cost of a garment, and you start to understand what it truly means when something costs almost nothing. And that shift in perspective wasn't something that I ever expected to learn, but now it's one of the things that I value the most. So when you're just starting out and wondering if all this time commitment is really worth when you are just creating a sweater, you just have to keep in mind that the sweater is pretty much the least of it. You have the calm, the creativity, the pride, the community, and the connection. And that is just so much more. Knitting has so much more to offer than just the finished object. The sweater is pretty much just the bonus. Tip 3. It's just knitting. You can always unravel and start over. I want to tell you something that took me longer than necessary to fully internalize, and it sounds so obvious when I talk about it right now, but it is just knitting. When you are not happy with the piece you're knitting for whatever reason, you can always unravel and start over. That's it. That's the tip. But let me tell you why it matters. When you're new to knitting, and honestly even when you're not so new, it can be so easy to have the decision you made when choosing the yarn and the pattern feel like a permanent one. You chose the pattern, you committed to a yarn, and now you're just going for it. Whether you are realizing that, I don't know, maybe you don't like the feel of the yarn in your hands, or you feel like the yarn and the pattern are not really going together, or you maybe don't like the construction of the piece you're making, but you just keep knitting until you're done. And that can be so disappointing, because then you have put all of that energy and time into creating a piece that you are not excited about wearing, but you also feel like the decision to unravel the whole thing, because you've invested so much time, almost feels a bit like admitting defeat. But here's the thing about knitting that I love so much, especially compared to sewing. Committing to a knitting pattern is not permanent, unless sewing, where once you have cut your fabric, the fabric is cut. It's a permanent decision. You cannot undo it. But with knitting, you always have the option to unravel and start over. This yarn here has been knitted and re-knitted twice already. I made a cardigan with it that didn't work out for me. Then I unraveled the whole thing and made another cardigan, and that also did not work out for me. And now I have just taken the time to unravel it again, and I will very soon try and reknit this yarn a third time, and hopefully this time I will be able to choose a pattern that genuinely suits the yarn and myself, of course. And I think that's totally fine. That's just how life goes sometime. And whenever you reclaim the yarn, you still have the whole thing with a whole sweater or however many skeins you have inside it. And you have learned something along the way as well, because you now know what didn't work. So if you choose a pattern and the yarn isn't doing what you hoped, just unravel it. Or if you're 3 weeks into a project and every time you pick it up something feels wrong, you can unravel it as well. Or even if you finish something and you know in your heart you'll never wear it, please just unravel it. The yarn is still there and your knitting time wasn't wasted because you learned something along the way. There are only a very few cases in knitting where your decisions are truly irreversible, and you can always take the yarn and just start over. And once you truly believe that, you can look at knitting in a different way. It becomes freer and a lot more joyful, and you are also willing to take more risks. You can tackle more challenging projects and see if it works out or not, and if it doesn't, you can always unravel. You can challenge yourself and learn new things, and if you think back about tip 1, that is exactly the point. And that low stakes, forgiving quality of knitting is something that I think makes it so perfect as a new hobby or skill to learn. And there are so many resources out there to help you along the way, and one of them is today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online community with thousands of classes where you can learn pretty much anything. And if you think about knitting specifically, there are classes that teach you the very basics, how to get started. There are classes for a bit more advanced techniques when you want to learn something very specific, and everything in between. I love that you can learn completely at your own pace and in your own time, from your sofa with your yarn already in your lap if you want. And as you can see here, Skillshare offers countless classes on knitting. You can learn the basics of knitting, you can learn how to knit a sweater, socks, cables, lace or color work. And there's also a class that teaches you how to read a knitting chart in the round, and that's one that I found super helpful. Because some patterns don't have everything in written instructions, some parts are only charted, and it can be a bit confusing when you're first starting out understanding how to properly read a knitting chart. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So if you've been looking for a gentle place to start, or if you're looking to learn some new to you techniques, I highly recommend that you give Skillshare a try. Alright, let's move on to tip number 4 now. Tip 4, be proud to be a knitter. I want to share something a little more personal with you, because when I first started knitting, I felt quite self-conscious about it. Not about the knitting itself, because I pretty much loved that from the very beginning, but about telling people about it, about being the person who knits. Because there is this image around knitting, isn't it? You think about, I don't know, grandmas in armchairs, although there is of course absolutely nothing wrong with being a grandma in an armchair. It's actually a period of my life that I'm very much looking forward to. But you know what I mean, right? It can feel a bit quaint and old-fashioned and slightly uncool. And when I seriously started knitting and creating garments for myself, I was in my early 30s, and I just wanted to be associated with that image, so I kept quiet and I felt a bit awkward when the topic came up. If I think about it now, it almost feels a bit funny to me how awkward I felt at the beginning talking about that I like to knit, because now that I have understood what knitting truly is, I know that it's one of the most creative and intentional and fulfilling ways I can spend my time, and that is just so wonderful. It is a skill that takes years to develop, and there is always something new to learn, and I highly value that. It's an act of resistance against a throwaway culture that tells us that everything has to be fast, cheap, and disposable. And there is nothing uncool about knitting. I know that now, and there actually never was. And I say this as someone who now even has a YouTube channel about knitting. I talk about knitting all the time to anyone who will listen to it. And I'm so proud to be part of this amazing community. So if you are new to knitting and you might feel a little awkward as well, just, put yourself out there. Take your knitting to places. Let people ask you about it, because I think this gives you a wonderful opportunity to really teach others what knitting truly is and what it isn't. It is a skill, it is a craft, and it's an art form as well. And you are going to be the one telling people about that you made this thing with your own two hands, some knitting needles and some yarn, and your love and patience. And if anyone gives you a hard time about it, they have never worn a sweater that they made themselves, and that is genuinely their loss. Tip 5. Think about how the piece will fit into your wardrobe before you cast on. This is a tip I truly would have wished someone had given me earlier in my knitting journey, and not because I made terrible choices, but because I was thinking about each project more in abstract rather than looking at my wardrobe as a whole. I chose patterns that were very popular at the time, or that looked great on other people, or colorways that I just admired on someone else, without really thinking about if they would go with the pieces that I have in my own wardrobe. And yeah, I think that is just such an important lesson to learn. And knitting simply takes too long for that, only for a piece, a finished object, to just, be stuffed in the back of your wardrobe and maybe worn once or twice and then never looked at again. We're talking about weeks, even months of knitting sometimes, and this time is just too precious to be wasted. So now, before I cast on anything, I ask myself 3 questions. First, does this actually suit me? Not if it looks beautiful on someone else, or if it's everywhere on Ravelry right now, or if it's the yarn that everyone is talking about this season. Does it suit me or you, in your case? Your coloring, your body, and the way you like to dress. Second, where would I wear this? Try to think of at least 2 or 3 real specific occasions or contexts in your actual life, not hypothetical ones. Not, I would wear this if I ever went somewhere nice, but real situations like your morning coffee or your commute or your Sunday walk. And if you can't place the finished piece in your real life, that's information worth having before you cast on. And third, does this work with what I already own? Think about the colors in your wardrobe, the pieces you already love and wear constantly. Will this new thing slot in alongside them, or will it sit slightly apart? Beautiful on its own, but somehow never quite the right thing to reach for. I also want to say something about climate, because this is obvious but can be overlooked so easily, I think. Because if you are drawn to those very chunky woolly sweaters, but you live somewhere where it's never quite cold enough to wear them, it doesn't really make sense to knit them then, does it? Or on the other hand, if you like to make beautiful drapey linen or silk garments, but you live in a place where it's colder most of the year, you should really think about then what to knit and what not to knit as well. I feel like this is obvious, but at the same time, sometimes we tend to use for our fantasy selves and not for our real, actual lives. I now think about knitting and my handmade wardrobe about building something intentional rather than just something that I am accumulating. And that shift in my perspective really changed everything about how I approach my knitting now. And that's also something we go really deep on in my online community, the Handmade Wardrobe Circle. We are discussing how to build wardrobes with intention, how to pick patterns and yarns that we love knitting, but that will also create pieces that we will treasure for years to come. And if this is something that resonates with you, I'm going to link it for you in the description box. You are more than welcome to join us. Tip 6. Yarn quality matters more than yarn price. I would like to talk about yarn, not about what it costs, but what about what it's worth. And this can be a bit tricky when you're just starting out, because I completely get it. You are new to this hobby and you don't want to commit and purchase something very expensive if you're not sure about, how it will turn out, and if you even want to stick with that hobby. But I know that it can be so easy, to just pick up this big skein in the craft store, or maybe even the acrylic skein, because it's cheaper than all of the other yarns, but it's not always the best choice. So please don't get me wrong. I don't want to tell you to not buy the more affordable option, because I think there is totally a place for it. But there are some things to consider as well, because picking the most affordable choice can also come at a very high cost later on. Cheap yarn is often a false economy, and that is because you are investing hours of your time into a knitting project. Let's say you are making a sweater that would take you anything from 30 to maybe up to 100 hours, depending on how fine the yarn is and how complex the project is. And if you are knitting with a cheap yarn, with a lower quality yarn that later on starts to pill immediately, or it completely stretches and the garment is out of shape, or it doesn't feel nice on your skin, then all of your precious resources, not your money, but your time and energy, which is worth far more than money, is just wasted. So what I would suggest instead is this. You do not need the most expensive yarn like cashmere yarn that I have here, but you need a good quality yarn. So whenever possible, I would opt for natural fibers. Look for wool, alpaca, cotton, linen, and if possible also feel the yarn before you purchase it, because it will immediately tell you if you are going to like to wear it against your skin. You can also check the reviews on Ravelry for the yarn you are interested in to get a better feel of how good the quality of the yarn really is, because high price doesn't always mean high quality, and on the contrary, that's true as well. Low price doesn't always mean low quality either. And here's a reframe that helped me. Don't think only about the cost per skein, also think about the hours of enjoyment you will get out of it. Because if you purchase a yarn and then you spend hours knitting with it and enjoying every minute of it, and then you're also treasuring the finished piece and are wearing it for years and years to come, that is going to be worth much more compared to a more affordable skein that you don't really enjoy working with and that you don't really like to wear or wear at all later on. And over time, you're going to develop a sense of what's worth spending a bit more on for you. And I think that knowledge is genuinely so valuable. Tip 7. It's okay, even encouraged, to have more than one whip. Let me say something that I think some newer knitters might have some trouble with. You might be thinking that a disciplined knitter casts something on and finishes it before he or she moves on to the next project. And I want to tell you that having more than one project or work in progress or whip going at a time is not a lack of focus or commitment or discipline. It can actually be very beneficial to your knitting practice. Not only is it completely fine to have more than one knitting project going at a time, I would even encourage it, because you're soon starting to recognize that your knitting can serve very different purposes in your day-to-day life. So sometimes you just need a very simple, very meditative project, and this is the one that I have here. It's a shawl I've been working on for a couple of months now actually. It is very simple double knitting that I do whenever I want to knit on something very mindless that I don't want to think about. Maybe I'm sitting down helping one of my kids with their homework and I just want to keep my hands busy, and that project is perfect for that. And then I have another work in progress that is a bit more elaborate. Let me see how it goes. Looks a bit strange at the moment. So that is the front, and as you can see, this is a lace pattern I'm currently working on. You can see a ton of stitch markers, so it is a bit more involved. I'm working from a chart and I have to pay a bit more of attention to it. And that serves a very different purpose. First, I'm looking very much forward to having this finished piece in my handmade wardrobe. And secondly, there are those times when I have like maybe a bit more of a longer period of time where I want to knit, let's say like 1 or 2 hours, and I really want to concentrate and follow the chart and sit down and focus. And that's when that project comes in handy. So those are two very different knitting experiences, and if you only have one project on the needles at a time, you have to make this project fit different purposes, and that can be a bit difficult. So having a simpler project and a bit of a more involved one on the needles at all times means that whatever the situation, you always have something to grab and start knitting. And I think it just makes for a more relaxed and balanced knitting life in general. So please give yourself permission to have at least one easier and one more complex project on the needles at all times, because knitting is supposed to fit into your life and not compete with it. And depending on the exact amount of whips you should have going at a time, I think this is very personal and differs from knitter to knitter. Some people like to have like a lot of options so that they have always something exciting to work on when they feel like it, depending on their mood and the situations. And other knitters like me are happier when they have like just a handful of whips. I like to have 2 or 3, for example, but that is something you are going to figure out for your own very soon. Tip 8. The tools matter, but don't buy everything at once. When you start knitting, the amount of tools that is out there can feel a bit overwhelming. There are so many things that people are telling you you absolutely need to have. You need to have blocking mats, a ball winder, a swift, different types of stitch markers and progress keepers, an arsenal of different knitting needles for every occasion, and much more. But in all honesty, you truly don't. You just have to start. So if you are just starting out, what I would do is just focus on the one project you have going at the time. Look at the absolute essential tools you need and just go from there, because knitting is such a tactile and personal craft, and you will soon discover that you have different preferences, and they might be very different from the preferences of another knitter, and recommendations can be a bit tricky in that space, and you will very quickly learn what you like and what you don't like. Take knitting needles, for example. There are different types of knitting needles with different materials. For example, there are metal needles who are very slick and you can knit very fast with them, but the yarn also slides off of them very quickly, and that can be a bit uncomfortable, especially for a beginner knitter where you want something, to feel a bit more secure with. And then there are wooden needles, for example, and those are a lot less slippery and grab the yarn a bit more, which can be great if you are more of a beginner or a bit more unsure of how the yarn is going to behave. But if you want to knit very fast, it can also feel like those wooden needles almost hold the yarn back and make your knitting slow and almost, that like you can't really get into the flow of things. So the thing is, those are very personal preferences and they are not interchangeable, and you definitely shouldn't invest in a interchangeable needle set like this one. Mine is from Jagu right at the beginning. Rather, I would just purchase the one needle or maybe the 2 sizes depending on the pattern that you need for this one project, and then try it out and see what you like and what you don't like. You could also, if you have a friend in your real life who knits as well, ask them if you can borrow some of their needles. And over time, when you know what your preferences are, you can definitely invest in an interchangeable needle set, and it's the greatest thing, but it's a bit more of an investment, and I would definitely hold off purchasing something that expensive in the beginning. So besides the needles, there are a couple of tools that I would consider essential and that I would recommend that you get, and that is like a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle for weaving in ends, some stitch markers. They can be very simple like the ones that I have here. I also have a measuring tape, and that's about it. Everything else can come later, and you will discover over time what you want and what you don't need. So start simple, learn what you like, and build from there. And your knitting can grow with you once you get more and more experienced. Tip 9. Always block your finished pieces. Blocking is one of those things I think a lot of new knitters don't do, and the more experienced knitters think it's a non-negotiable. And I think the reason why a lot of newer knitters don't do it, because 1, either they don't know it exists, or 2, they know it exists, but it sounds too complicated and they would much rather just wear the finished object. But I want to convince you that blocking is not optional and that it's very well worth it. Because once you do it for the very first time and you realize how it transformed a finished piece, you will never want to skip that step again. So what is blocking? At its most basic, it's getting your finished knitting wet and then laying it flat to dry in the shape you want it to be. And that's it. That's the whole process for most projects. But what it does is truly remarkable because it allows the fabric to relax and find its shape. And uneven stitches are even themselves out and everything is looking much more polished and put together, especially if you are knitting something with lace, for example, that's opening up beautifully, or cables. Blocking can truly transform a garment, especially if you are thinking about like a sweater or cardigan that can maybe look a bit stiff once you're done with the knitting, but totally transforms and gets very drapey and beautiful once it's blocked. So there are a few practical things worth noting. Most natural fibers like wool, alpaca, linen, silk or whatever block beautifully, but some of the synthetic fibers or something with a superwash treatment on top of it can stretch out in a very weird way or stretch out significantly. So it is definitely worth having a look at the label beforehand and also knitting a swatch and blocking that so that you just know what you're getting yourself into. And the golden rule that I mentioned in my other video where I was talking about 10 knitting tips is to always knit a swatch and that you measure the swatch before and after blocking, because this will give you some very valuable information about how the finished knitted fabric behaves once you block it. I know it sounds like an additional step, but I promise you, once you give it a try, you will definitely never want to skip this step again. Tip 10. Take notes as you go. Ravelry makes this beautifully easy. For the next tip, I want to talk about something that will save you an enormous amount of frustration and that you will thank yourself later for it, and that is always take notes. I know it sounds very obvious, and I'm saying this with complete solidarity because I've been there myself more times than I can count. You are in the process of knitting and you're in the flow and you just don't want to take the time and write something down, and you're telling yourself that you will remember, but in the end you are unsure about what needle size you used or maybe what modifications you made to the sleeve length, or I don't know how many stitches you picked up for the gusset when knitting a sock or whatever. You just can't remember, and this can be so frustrating. But it gets even worse because imagine you are knitting a sweater and you are making some modifications along the way to tailor it to your specific body, and you love the outcome, and then a couple years later you want to make it again, and then you realize that you didn't take any notes and you just can't remember what you did, and all of this valuable information is just gone. And that is where I think Ravelry is one of the most useful tools available for knitters that is out there, because it makes the whole process so simple. You can create a project page for every new knitting project that you start. You can mark the date when you started and when you finished, but what I find especially valuable is that you can add pictures, you can add your yarn and the colorway and the needle size and the gauge, and add any notes that you want to remember, and it just makes it so beautifully simple for you to do. Takes about 3 minutes to set up when you cast on, and then a few seconds to update as you go, and what you get in return is a complete record of every project you've ever made. What worked, what didn't, what you changed next time, what needle sizes gave you the right gauge with that particular yarn, and over time that record becomes genuinely invaluable. It's like a knitting journal that builds itself. And at the absolute minimum, even if you are not using Ravelry, I would highly encourage you to take some notes about the needle size you're using, the gauge you're getting, and any modifications that you're making to the pattern. And you are definitely going to thank yourself later for it. So I hope you found something useful in this video, whether you are a newer knitter or you have been knitting for years and years. I hope there was still something in it for you. Knitting is truly so much more to me than just creating beautiful garments, and I hope you feel the same way. And if you like to think about knitting in this more intentional way as well, and like to build a handmade wardrobe that feels very coherent and very you, I encourage you to have a look at my online community, the Handmade Wardrobe Circle. We would love to welcome you in there, and I'll see you next time. Happy knitting. Take care. Bye.